Welcome to Transform Now, the podcast brought to you by SS&C Blue Prism. Agentic automation isn't just the next step in automation, it's the future of how work gets done. By enabling intelligent, autonomous agents to take action, adapt, and collaborate, organizations are unlocking new levels of productivity, growth, and customer delight. Join us as we explore how agentic automation is reshaping work for the better, for customers, employees, shareholders, and most importantly, you. To stay on top of the hottest topics in the world of agentic automation, subscribe now. Let's get into the show.
Hello, everyone. Brad Hairston here. Welcome to Transform Now. Joining me today is Kelly Monahan, PhD and author, AI advisor, and a future of work expert. Kelly was on the show last year. We talked about things that most C-level execs are getting wrong about AI. It was a great conversation, and I'm sure this one will be as well. Welcome back, Kelly.
Thanks
Why
so much,
don't you provide an introduction to kind of remind our listeners about yourself?
Yes, no, thank you so much. So I've been studying the future of work, for about 15 years now. Grew up in consulting, spent some time at Meta, and most recently Upwork. Spent my time in tech. And I've decided that this moment is so great. And I think leaders are struggling so much with AI integration. And so I've decided to strike out my own. I'm co-founder of a new business called Beyond the Desk. And the whole goal is to really help advise in this moment when you have compounding effects of Gen Z, macroeconomic uncertainty, and AI knocking on the doorsteps. How do leaders navigate this complexity? And so that's what I'm laser focused on these days.
Excellent. You're probably the only future of work expert that I know, Kelly. So I definitely appreciate your viewpoint on everything going on in the workforce today. Certainly, I don't know that we've seen a time frame with so much change at such an incredible pace as we are right now. You would know best about that.
Brett, can I comment on that real quick? Because I think that's actually super
Yeah, go
important for
ahead.
your audience. Because this is what I've been talking about a lot. So I work with economists a lot, which is great because we get to study the actual shocks that are taking place in the leader's organizational model. 20 years ago, if you were leading a business, you can maybe expect, depending on your industry, 3 to 5 of those shocks during your entire tenure. Today, over the last 18 months, we've had what economists would consider about 6 to 7 actual shocks in an 18-month period. So I think you're right. And I hope your audience, can maybe sigh a little exhale there, that this is definitely a different environment than we've ever seen before.
Yeah. Sure hope our younger workers in the workforce are more resilient than I am. I would have a hard time with that much change.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, Kelly, some of your recent research that I was reading found that 77% of employees say that AI has actually increased their workload, which is fascinating. And, for people that are building these systems, I have to ask, what are they fundamentally misunderstanding about how their tools get adopted and used in their production environments?
So what's so interesting, I had to do qualitative research to ask why 77% of employees were feeling like workload was increasing, not decreasing. Because the promise of AI is to make people efficient and to free up anywhere of right now 20 to 30% capacity. But here's what the employees said, a couple things. Number one, there's been a lack of training and development that goes alongside these AI tools. So a lot of people told me, hey, Kelly, I got an OpenAI login or I got a Copilot login. And that was it. Like there was no actual training of how to actually use these tools. And I've had a lot of friction in actually, learning and incorporating them. The second thing is we haven't necessarily reimagined the workflow itself. And so like what I tell leaders today, if you were to have a blank slate, knowing AI is now able to come in as a coworker or a tool, however you want to approach it, would you design work the same way? Most say no, but we have actually done that at the individual level. And so there feels to be a lot of friction for employees. And then finally, this is the one that's kind of the quiet part, spoken out loud, is we've added AI on as a priority without necessarily taking away anything else. And we know from behavioral science, people can manage about 3 to 5 priorities at a time. I'm hearing from folks going into 2026, that list is closer to 15 to 20 right now. And so I think it's also just cognitive overload.
Interesting. Well, you've described the current situation as a productivity paradox. where technology advances exponentially, but investment in skilling lags behind,
Yeah.
which I think is a really good observation. If we accept that AI literacy is now a baseline requirement, what does an effective AI upskilling program look like for organizations, especially those with thousands of employees? What does that look like?
I think the problem is we don't know what AI skills actually are today because they're so new and everyone wants them, but no one necessarily knows how to define them. So I want to just first provide how I'm thinking about skills so then we can figure out how do you actually train for them. The very first, you have to have domain expertise. I think we're, thinking through, there's a lot of conversations around critical judgment being outsourced. I do worry that, especially for the younger generation, there's going to be a little bit of a leap and not necessarily having that strong domain expertise. So one, we have to train for that. Two, and this is a tough one for leaders, but everyone I think today has to be a data analyst. You have to know where your data is.
Mm.
You have to know basic statistics if you're going to actually be empowered and democratized to use these AI tools. Very few people today have an understanding of how these AI models work. And I think that's actually a hindrance.
Mhm.
So that's part two. Part three, which is becoming really interesting too, is do you buy an AI tool or do you build? And I think having a really clear understanding of the AI ecosystem and the tooling ecosystem is important. So those are the three ways that I am defining AI literacy that I think we need to train towards.
Mhm.
Once now we have that solid foundation, it's back to change management 101 of how would you get an employee to learn anything new? You've got to make sure that the incentives are in place for learning. You have to make sure that time is protected. And I think right now employees are doing more of a wild, wild west approach because my research has also found only 1 in 4 organizations today have a formal AI program. And, finally, what I would say coming from Accenture, almost a million person organization, they make it mandatory to go through a technology development program, call it technology digital fluency. Every quarter, we had to go through pretty extensive training on what the technology is, its use cases, be tested for an assessment afterwards. And I am so thankful for that foundation because it has allowed me to better grasp AI, better understand the fundamentals. And so I think Accenture is actually a great model for a lot of organizations to learn how do you do this at scale.
Yeah. I'm sure you spent some time at St. Charles at their
I
at
for
their
sure did.
training facility. I grew up in Accenture as well, Anderson Consulting back then, but yeah, I'm sure we crossed paths a couple times. Well, I saw an article just last week, and I know you've seen this too, but Pearson released some research about AI upskilling, and they said that we could add between 4.8 trillion and 6.6 trillion to the US economy if we invested in upskilling instead of replacing workers. And that's a huge number, but I assume you agree with the scale of it.
Yeah, when I was actually at Accenture again, we were partnered with Amazon to look at upskilling programs. I mean, Amazon's been pretty overt that they're actually trying to go in the opposite direction, but automate, as many jobs as possible.
Mhm.
But they've got this great program that I'm not sure many people know about where they actually invest heavily in the upskilling to make sure that their employees are able to move into mobile pathways. And I think what's happening, I don't know, Brad, if you see this too, is I see leaders playing checkers and not chess right now with AI and upskilling.
Yeah.
And there is this need, everyone's looking for a lever coming out of the pandemic, coming out of, just changing customer spending and behavior to figure out how do I move faster and how do I increase my profit margins? And AI seems to be a promise of that. But the problem is if we don't actually invest alongside of people, you're never going to, no technology can work along without its people.
Mhm.
And so I agree with
Yeah.
Pearson's research. I think the question though, and I think that we've got to really start figuring out is there will be some jobs that AI is going to do better and that can be automated. How do we capture that and move people up? And that's kind of a lot of the research I was doing with Amazon is actually having a stepwise change and moving people into better career mobility pathways. The problem was, if we're going to be honest, about 7 years ago, that was into coding jobs. And so we were doing a lot of that stepwise into software engineering and coding and, app development. And so I do think we have to figure out
Yeah.
now that AI is actually coming for
Mm.
that, what does that next?
Yeah.
And then maybe it's not knowledge work. I mean, that's also uncomfortable truth. Not everything has to be knowledge work. And maybe it's something different and going
Mhm.
more to the trades or looking at apprenticeships, that sort of thing.
Something else that you're research revealed that I wanted to ask you about the fact that 47% of employees say they don't know how to achieve the expected productivity gains with AI. That's just amazing. I mean, what do you think is the disconnect here, and how do we fix that?
I think it's a couple things that I'm observing, both the research and, obviously meeting with organizations today. Number one is we talked about, there hasn't been training we have to go through in order to actually gain that productivity. It's not an overnight switch. The second thing, though, is employees are getting increasingly frustrated that it has been a nonstop linear growth pathway that leaders are expecting. And so it has been, again, I'm kind of coming out of the pandemic. Everything has been faster. We've got to do with less. We see organizations actually beginning to contract in size. And so it is not hyperbole to say that people are doing more with less resources. And I think there's this assumption that AI is going to help fill that capacity gap that many organizations are feeling, and they necessarily don't want to continue to hire full-time headcount. And so I think that's a little bit of what I'm seeing from an employee perspective is they're, being asked to do more with less. There's been no work redesign. There's been no training. And I think it's also like an abstract way of thinking about this of like, does that mean I'm sending out more customer emails? Like, what does more productivity actually look like? And that's where I'm helping leaders right now is do the harder part of what are you freeing up? Why? And then what do you expect people to do with this new capacity? And the last stat I'll give
Right.
you, it's actually from Slack. I think they did a great research project last year, and they found of the freed capacity, on average, knowledge workers were getting, about 22% time back from using an AI tool. Problem is they went and did more busy work. They didn't actually capture that
Yeah.
into value or creativity. And so I think that's a little bit of why employees aren't feeling productive. They're doing more of the same, not something
Mhm.
different.
Wow, that's really interesting. Just to follow on to that, Kelly, you like to emphasize the shift from measuring like speed and efficiency to measuring things like strategy and creativity and innovation, more intrinsically human,
Yep.
qualities. What are some metrics we should be tracking to facilitate this?
I think there's two ways that organizations can be rethinking performance management right now. The first is something that Microsoft has done like a decade ago, and that is actually changing the questions that are in the performance cycle. And so usually, this is where I think there's a little bit of a paradox going on as well. Leaders tell me, Kelly, I need more cross-functional communication. I need employees to be thinking outside the box more, finding more value, better servicing your customers. And then whether you're at like a quarterly or yearly individual output, what have you done for me lately? And so I think that's the disconnect. And so employees do want to be measured against. I want to be measured against the creativity I'm bringing or the customers I'm experiencing. The problem is that is hard, and that is not
Right.
the way. Like there is no going to be nice Workday plugin that you can use right now to capture that. But by using the Microsoft
Yeah.
question, they said in their performance reviews, "How are you making others around you better?" And that outward approach immediately begins to signal employees, oh, part of my job is making sure that I'm making the system healthy. It's not just about me producing more, it's about my contribution to the broader system. And once you start tying pay and bonuses to that sort of perspective, behavior changes. The second thing that I'm really bullish on is qualitative data because of AI. As a researcher, we would shy a bit away from qualitative data because it's unstructured data, it's really messy to work with, it can be pretty subjective, and it just takes time to read comments and all of that. With AI, I am pretty bullish that there's going to be an HR company that figures out how to actually measure with the digital exhaust that's occurring, cross collaboration, communications, the level of innovation that may be happening. Certainly, there'll be a level of subjectivity to that. But the reality is,
Yeah.
we should be able to start putting some measurement on our unstructured data and conversations that are happening every day. Again, in a way that doesn't violate employees' privacy, doing it at the aggregate level. But I'm pretty bullish that we're going to start figuring this out in the next year or two.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. Kelly, you're in your last book that you wrote that was called Essential. You and your co-author, Christy Smith, you argued for something you called human-powered leadership in the AI age, and I really like that. What does this practically mean when you're an organization that's starting to deploy AI agents that are going to become more and more autonomous over time. I mean, where's the line between human empowerment and human bottleneck?
Mhm. So I think it's just getting really critical to start differentiating between human intelligence and artificial intelligence. And I see leaders crisscrossing these sometimes, to be fully honest with you. And I see this show up in the data of
Hmm.
like a Stanford study that came out last year that showed that 41% of the tasks that were being automated were the actual tasks that humans wanted to do. And humans actually thought they were doing better than AI. Human powered is what are the actual things that humans are good at? We know they are good at novelty. We know we're good at ethical judgment, being able to actually connect and see one another. Likewise, we know AI is really good at identifying patterns. We also, though, know it's pretty much programmed to show you the dominant discourse of all the knowledge that's been out there on the internet. It's going to give you, it's a lot of it's going to give you the average answer, most mainstream thought. That's not often what you want. You want a little bit of,
Yeah.
the chaotic answer that comes from left field that actually breaks through it from an innovation perspective. So we talk about human powered leadership. What we mean is you should be taking all that micromanagement, everything that we learned in MBA programs, planning, controlling, directing resources, apply that to AI agents. That is a great management philosophy as you think about AI agents and managing and delegating that workflow. But when it comes to humans, we've got to really rethink how we're leading. And that becomes, how do you lead with empathy? Right now, knowing that there's so much going on in the world, from a business perspective, you're no longer just managing a P&L, you're also managing a societal polarized workforce that's coming in every day. We're all reading the headlines every weekend, and you have to navigate that. That is not, AI can't do that for you. And you have to understand the context and all that implicit knowledge that doesn't necessarily exist somewhere in a database that AI can draw from. So that's what we mean is getting really clear with the different types of intelligence that are in your workflow now and making sure that you've got a two-lever
Hmm.
approach. Micromanage the heck out of the AI agent, but really come back up and figure out how do you become empathetic, contextual, and really curious about the people you're leading.
Kelly, you've written some things about the Gen Z element of our workforce. I guess they're the youngest generation in our workforce. Is that right?
That is
We don't have Gen Y in there yet.
not
Okay.
yet coming.
Sooner than
Yeah.
later. Yeah. And anytime I see something about Gen Z, it catches my attention because I have a son and a daughter-in-law in that generation. And you said in something you wrote that Gen Z is redefining what it means to have a long-term career, with many essentially rejecting, corporate structures, if you will. The question I have for you is, as agentic AI starts enabling more outcome-based work, things like that, are we headed toward a future where, the traditional employment model is primarily going to be for support functions while the value creation is happening through more flexible kind of talent networks that are working alongside AI? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the social contract has been eroding for the last decade when it comes to what does full-time employment actually look like. And doing, coming
Hmm.
from Upwork, which is a freelancer platform, I studied a lot of why Gen Z was going this way. And they actually found that there was a lot more stability in taking a portfolio approach to their career. And I liken this to how we think about our investments. During times of turbulence, you don't go all in on one company. You really look to diversify different forms of assets. And I think because the world
Hmm.
is so turbulent, companies are staying, going out of business longer than, faster, I should say, than previous decades. We really don't know what this like full-time employment model looks like and the amount of contracting and layoffs that are happening. Certainly have Gen Z spooked. So I actually think, to your point, the future of work is going to look much more like a portfolio. Maybe they have a W-2 job here in the States, but they're also supplementing that
Hmm.
with some other work, whether that's on Etsy or on an Upwork platform or creating a side hustle. And I think that's smart. I think as leaders, it's difficult to realize, hey, maybe our talent isn't going to just be working for us. We might have to share this, obviously not with a competitor. But the reality is that's how I think things are going to start going. And I actually think it's wonderful because in all my research I've shown, when you have an employee who's actually context switching and seeing something that's going on in other industries, they actually are bringing that knowledge back in house and bringing novelty back into your organization, which I think is pretty desperately needed today.
Yeah. Mm, love that. Kelly, I know you also have thoughts on AI governance. And so I want to ask you a question about
Yeah.
that. It's a topic that every company is thinking about. I would say many are freaking out about. And my company's religious about
Yeah.
it as well. What would you say are the critical elements of AI governance that distinguish, a real well implemented AI strategy versus just rolling out something for the sake of having it?
I think it's a great question, Brad. And I was just with a bunch of compliance leaders a couple weeks ago. And here's where they're struggling with is in order to get the productivity gains that these leaders are expecting, means that they have to put in a lot of data and IP into the system itself. I think that is where the rubber is meeting the
Sure.
road is there's not enough
Yeah.
trust in the companies right now that are leading the large language models. I think there's concern about cybersecurity breaches, about information leaks. And so I think that is what we've got to problem solve is how are you able to actually enable the promise of AI, but do so in a way that you're putting
Hmm.
your data in that's protected. And I don't think even the AI companies have quite
Right.
figured that out. And part of that is we're moving from a really close, you think about like on-premise back in the day, technology
Mhm.
and databases. Then we moved to the cloud. And so that was that was a huge transition, 15, 10 years ago for
Mhm.
executives to say, I no longer control data in my location, but I'm going to now have it to the cloud. We've got to now figure out how to make that transition
Right.
to AI. I think that is a 3 to 5 year runway for most organizations. And so
Mhm.
I think that's going to be part of it. But to answer your question in terms of like what are good governance practices, one, I think it's more than just having a long employee compliance policy. It is actually having a philosophy around what is your philosophy around AI usage? What is the fundamentals? What do you
Mhm.
actually believe in? And I see a lot of
Yeah.
organizations haven't done that work yet because it's hard and messy. And then second, I think is figuring out what are your fail safes? Like what do you have in place so you're going to be able to recognize if things are going sideways? And the reality is, just the reality for compliance leaders right now is most employees have a personal login with a lot of these AI tools. And I've heard use case after use case of where things have gotten leaked or information has gone out because they haven't necessarily used a closed
Yeah.
system. And so that's just going to be the challenge. I think it's going to take us a few years to really
Mm.
learn. And again, I would go back to what did we learn from going from on-premise to cloud? Same thing here.
Kelly, if you step back, just looking at all the research that you've done, the books you've written, the advisory work that you're doing with companies, if you were advising, a chief automation officer or the head of AI, what would you say is one fundamental mindset shift that they need to make to be successful in 2026 and beyond?
I think the number one thing that we have to really think about is, and I see this all the time, but augmentation over automation. Automation is a low hanging fruit that is going to make you move faster. It is not
Mhm.
going to necessarily give you that value proposition or competitive edge in the long run. I think if I'm an AI officer right now, I'm actually beginning to slow down a bit to figure out what is the actual market opportunity? What is a better way to meet my customer value?
Yeah.
And I don't see those conversations happening in most organizations. It's really how do I move productivity? How do I have efficiency? And as part of this mindset shift, it's not going to be a one for one of we've plugged in AI here. Now we get to, remove part of the workforce. Companies have tried that already, and we've already seen that mass return of back to the human workforce because it just doesn't work that way. And so I think we've got to figure out how do we actually fund this appropriately if we're not necessarily just driving efficiency. And that means you have to be bringing in new revenue. And I think that's what we have to do is how do you actually tie this to new revenue, not just cost reduction?
Yep. That's a great point. Well, Kelly, I'd like to wrap up
Sure.
by reflecting on a post that I saw from you the other day. You were talking about the fact that you just finished the manuscript for a new book that will come out here sooner than later. And you talked about in this post that you're super excited about it, that you're touching on a lot of things that people aren't talking about enough. So I was wondering if you could give us a little preview about, what's the subject matter. That would be great to hear.
Yes. No, thank you, Brad, for that question. So the title of the book is called We've Lost the Plot. And it's really, I've created a fictional company because I'm not here to assign blame or this is not to beat up any one organization. It's really to
Yeah.
capture the trend that I've observed over really the last decade, but really heightened over the last 3 years, of how leaders are drifting away from their people, from the purpose of the organization, from really the purpose of business, really drifting away from a lot of those core values and things that we know work. The second part is really about delirium and how leaders are becoming delirious around AI, Gen Z, and really these things that are happening all at once is creating complexity, but we're isolating them in leadership. And so I think that makes us delirious. And I think, just watch Gen Z on TikTok and they're shouting about this. And then ultimately, what I try to do in this book is bring forward the dream of in this moment, there's a lot of opportunity. We are at tremendous technological progress. We have more intelligence than we've ever had before. And yet all of our systems are blinking red in terms of how employees are feeling, how leaders are feeling, how business value is growing. And so we've got to course correct this. And I think we have a short runway to do that. And that's what this book does, is really help leaders. How do you regain the plot of work? Because I think so many have drifted over the last couple of years.
And when do you expect it's going to be published? Is it sometime this year?
I'm hoping September 29th. It will be in bookshelves.
Fantastic. Well, Kelly, it's so important in today's world to keep the workforce right at the heart of everything that that all of our companies are doing with technology. And technology can kind of suck up all of our attention, but we've got to be thinking about the impact on the people, because the people are the most precious asset of any organization. We know that. And so I always appreciate your perspective, and it's great to have you back on the show to talk about all these things. So thank you. I'm sure we will have you back again in the not so distant future.
Thank you so much, Brad.
I wish you the very best.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Transform Now, the podcast from SS&C Blue Prism. You can find all of our episodes on your favorite podcast channel, as well as YouTube. To stay on top of the hottest topics in the world of agentic automation, subscribe now. The future of work is here.